He rejected her in front of the entire pack and left her to die in the Deadwood Forest. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was believing she actually died. Alpha Prince Caden Voss did it publicly, which was the part that was supposed to be final. Public rejection was the irreversible kind, the kind that stripped the rejected mate of their pack bond, their territory protection, and their claim to any resource the pack had ever extended to them. In a single spoken declaration in front of 240 Ironvale pack wolves, he made Nara Cole into someone who did not exist inside the protection of any pack structure in the known territories. He did it because his new chosen mate, the daughter of the Silver Brand Pack Alpha, required it. He did it because the political alliance the Silver Brand match would produce was worth more to his ambitions than a bond he had never chosen and a mate he had been embarrassed by since the day the pairing was recognized. He did it because Nara was an Omega with no wolf form on record and the weakest classification in the Ironvale pack registry, and he had decided that the thing his wolf had recognized in her was a malfunction rather than a truth. He had the pack guards walk her to the Deadwood Forest boundary and leave her there without food, without shelter, and without the traveling cloak she had asked for. It was the middle of winter. What Caden Voss did not know, what no one in the Ironvale pack had ever been told, was what lived inside the woman he had just sent to die. Nara Cole had not been classified as weak because she was weak. She had been classified as weak because her mother, 3 days before she died of a sickness that Nara now understood had not been natural, had sat with her in the dark of their cottage and held her face in both hands and said, "Do not let them see what you are. Not ever. The moment they see it, they will try to take it from you, or they will try to destroy it, and either way you will lose something that has taken 8 generations to preserve. Promise me you will hide it until you cannot anymore." Nara had been 12 years old. She had promised. She had kept that promise for 10 years through every indignity and every dismissal and every public humiliation that came with being the lowest-ranked Omega in a pack that measured worth in wolf capability and found hers invisible. She had kept it through the rejection. She kept it while the guards walked her to the Deadwood boundary. She kept it until the guards turned back toward the warm lights of the Ironvale packhouse, and she was alone in the dark and the cold with the winter forest around her and the certainty of what would happen to an unshifted Omega without shelter in the Deadwood Inn. Midwinter fully assembled in her mind. Then she stopped keeping it. And the Deadwood Forest, which had not seen anything like what stood in it that night in living memory, went completely silent. 3 months later, the Alpha King himself rode north to understand why a third of the Ironvale pack's border wolves had simply refused to enter a specific sector of the Deadwood Forest, and why the 2 scout units he had sent to investigate had come back, describing something that did not exist in any current wolf classification. He was not prepared for what he found. And he was even less prepared for what it recognized in him. Subscribe, comment, like, share. Subscribe and leave a comment telling us what you think Nara found in the Deadwood. Share this immediately with everyone who loves a wolf heroine who is left to die. Like the video. Chapter 1. What the Deadwood received. The Deadwood Forest earned its name 300 years before Nara was born and had been maintaining the reputation ever since. It occupied a 40-kilometer stretch of the northern Ironvale territory boundary, dense old-growth forest that had been unclaimed by any pack for so long that it had developed its own internal ecology, its own rules about what lived in it and what did not, and a specific quality of atmospheric presence that made every wolf in every pack that bordered it instinctively certain that whatever was in the Deadwood was not going to respond well to casual intrusion. The Ironvale pack guards knew this when they walked Nara to the boundary. She could tell by the way they stopped exactly at the tree line and went no further. By the way the younger of the two would not look at the forest directly. By the way they turned back to the packhouse faster than the walkout had required. She stood at the Deadwood boundary and watched them go, and then she turned and looked at what was in front of her. She was wearing her standard Omega service dress, the pale gray of low rank, and she had managed, in the 30 seconds between the rejection declaration and the guards arriving at her cottage, to escort her, to put on her boots and her gloves and nothing else. The cloak she had asked for had not been provided. The temperature was the temperature of the Ironvale High Territory in midwinter, which was the kind of cold that the pack's medics described as survivable for standard wolves for approximately 6 to 8 hours without shelter and significantly less than that for Omegas without wolf form capacity. She had been standing at the boundary for 4 minutes. She had been calculating for 3 of them. Her mother's instructions had been specific. Hide it until you cannot anymore. The question she had been asking herself for the 4 minutes since the guards left was whether this qualified as cannot anymore. Whether a winter forest, a 6 to 8 hour survivability window, and the complete removal of every external protection was the circumstance her mother had had in mind when she said those words. She thought it probably was. She thought her mother, who had been deeply practical in the way of people who had spent their lives managing something dangerous in an environment that would destroy it if it became visible, would have said that promising to hide it forever was never the point. The point was to hide it until hiding it was more dangerous than showing it. Until the calculation shifted. The calculation had shifted. She walked into the Deadwood. The forest received her the way the Deadwood received everything that entered it, with the specific quality of attention that very old places give to things they are deciding about. The trees were close and the canopy was dense and the ground was frozen, but the snow was not deep because the canopy kept it from accumulating, and within 50 meters of the boundary the wind dropped to nothing because the old growth was thick enough to stop it. She kept walking north. She walked until she found what she had known would be in the Deadwood if she went deep enough, which was what her mother's second set of instructions, the ones she had given in the same cottage session with the same gravity, had described. Not a landmark. Not a map reference. A feeling. The specific resonant pull of old blood recognizing old blood, the signal that the lineage texts her mother had given her described as the call of the ancestral ground. The ground that had been waiting for the lineage to come back to it. She felt it at 3 kilometers north of the boundary. She followed it for another 1.5 kilometers. And then she found the Heartwood. It was a clearing in the deep Deadwood, and it was not a clearing that had been made by anyone. It was a clearing that existed because the trees around its perimeter had been growing in that specific arrangement for longer than the current generation of those trees had been alive. A circle of the oldest growth in the Deadwood creating an open space that the moonlight reached directly and that the cold did not reach in the same way the cold reached everything outside it. The clearing floor was covered in frost, but it was not the hostile frost of the open winter. It was the frost of a place that was simply cold in the way that sleeping things are cold, present but not threatening. At the center of the clearing was the stone. Her mother had described it. In the lineage texts it was called the recognition stone, the anchor of the ancestral ground, the object through which the ground confirmed bloodline and released what had been held in the earth for the bloodline's return. It was large, roughly the height of a person and half again as wide, covered in growth that was not quite moss and not quite anything she had a name for, and it was the source of the signal she had been following. She pressed both hands against it. The clearing went warm. Not temperature warm. The specific warmth of recognition. The warmth that the text described as the ancestral ground acknowledging the return of the blood that had been invested in it by 8 generations of women who had survived impossible circumstances and brought what they carried to the next generation and the next until it arrived in a clearing in the Deadwood on the night that the last of them had been left there to die. Nara pressed her forehead against the stone and let go of 10 years of maintained suppression. The shift, when it came, was not a standard shift. It was not even close to a standard shift. It was the specific transformation that the lineage texts called the full inheritance, the expression of every accumulated capability that 8 generations of women had carried forward and added to and never fully used because the world they occupied never gave them the conditions for full use. Each generation had held what they received and added what they developed and passed it forward, and the accumulation had been building for 8 generations toward the one that finally had nowhere left to hide it. The Deadwood registered it. Every tree in the Heartwood clearing shed its frost simultaneously as the heat of the transformation moved through the ground from the stone, and the clearing filled with a light that was not fire and was not moonlight, but was the specific luminescence of the ancestral ground activated by the bloodline it had been waiting for. The wolf that stood in the Heartwood clearing when the transformation completed was nothing the current classification system had a category for. She was the color of deep earth and old copper, a rich dark auburn that caught the ancestral ground light and returned it as something warmer, and she was large in the absolute sense of the word. Not large compared to other wolves, but large in the way that required the clearing to reorganize its available space to contain her. Her eyes were the specific deep gold of the recognition stone's surface, the same gold, the exact same gold, as if the stone and the wolf were made of the same thing because they were. She stood in the Heartwood clearing and she breathed. The Deadwood Forest, which had been maintaining its reputation for 300 years by being the place that things did not come back from, registered the presence in its center with the specific response of very old land that has been holding something in trust and has just received confirmation that the trustee has arrived. It went calm, not empty. Not silent. Calm in the way of something that has completed a long task and is now simply at rest. Nara ran in the Heartwood clearing until dawn, and the cold was not cold, and the dark was not dark, and the wolf that she had been hiding for 10 years was finally, completely, in the world that she had been built for. She shifted back at dawn and sat against the recognition stone, and looked at the clearing around her and made plans. She was going to need the winter. She was going to need everything the ancestral ground could teach her about what she was now carrying. And then she was going to need to decide what to do with it. The decision was not difficult. She had made it the moment Caden Voss opened his mouth in front of 240 wolves and said the words that left her here. She was going to make sure that every single person who had decided she was worth nothing understood with complete clarity exactly how wrong they had been. Not from bitterness. From accuracy. Chapter 2. 3 months of becoming. The Deadwood was not empty. This was the thing that the Ironvale pack wolves who refused to enter the northern sector of the Deadwood could not have told you precisely, because their refusal was instinctive rather than analyzed. The specific avoidance behavior of pack wolves whose wolf nature was receiving a signal from the territory that their conscious minds could not fully interpret. The signal was, "This is not yours, and what is in it is above your classification." What was in it was Nara. She spent the first week in the Heartwood clearing learning the ancestral ground's full scope. The recognition stone was not simply an anchor. It was a repository, the accumulated stored knowledge of 8 generations of women who had made their contributions to the lineage and whose understanding of what the blood was and how it worked had been deposited in the stone for exactly this use. The access was not verbal and not visual. It was the specific knowledge transfer that only the bloodline could receive, experiential rather than informational. And it came to Nara across 7 days of contact with the stone in the form of capabilities she had not had before and the understanding of how to use them. Capabilities was not quite the right word. The full inheritance was not a set of powers in the way that wolf hierarchies described power, as something layered onto a base nature. It was the base nature itself, fully expressed, the specific nature of a wolf whose ancestral function was not dominance or territory or pack governance, but something that predated all of those structures. The lineage texts called it the keeper function. The wolf that maintained the territory itself, rather than the pack within the territory. The wolf whose relationship was with the land rather than with the hierarchy built on the land. The Deadwood was not dead. It was hers. She understood this in the second week when she began to move through the Deadwood outside the Heartwood clearing, and the forest responded to her movement not as a presence in it, but as an expression of it. The trees and the ground and the air all oriented around her with the ease of a system that had been waiting for its organizing principle to arrive. The pack wolves at the Deadwood boundary felt this without understanding it. Their wolf nature said, "Do not enter." The thing in there outranks you in a way that is not about pack hierarchy, and is not about physical capability, and is not about any of the metrics your classification system gives you to assess these situations. The Ironvale Pack commander of the northern border sector filed 3 separate incident reports about wolf behavior anomalies in the Deadwood boundary zone across the 3 months of Nara's winter in the forest. The 3rd report reached Caden Voss. He read it and filed it under territorial drift, the standard classification for unexplained boundary behavior that required monitoring but did not warrant immediate response. The 3rd report also reached, through the interpack intelligence sharing arrangement that the Alpha King maintained with all 6 pack territories, the desk of the King's intelligence coordinator. Nara spent the 3rd week learning the specific application of the Keeper function that the lineage texts described as territory communication, the ability to extend her awareness through the land itself rather than through standard wolf senses. The range was not the range of a standard wolf's sensory capacity. It was the range of the territory she held, which was the Deadwood, which was 40 kilometers of dense northern forest. She knew everything that moved in it. She knew when the Ironvale Pack sent the 1st scout unit into the southern edges of the Deadwood in the 2nd month. She watched them through the territory sense as they moved through the old growth, watched them encounter the atmospheric edge of the Heartwood sector, watched them stop without being able to explain why they had stopped, and watched them turn back. She let them go. She spent the 2nd month working through the combat applications of the full inheritance, which the lineage texts described with a specificity that told her the women who wrote them had not been theorizing. They had been recording actual use. The Keeper function in full expression was not a fighting capability in the standard sense. It did not produce larger claws or greater physical strength relative to the classification above it. It produced something that the texts called territory force, the capacity to use the territory itself as an extension of the wolf's will. And the combat applications of that capacity were what had been used by previous generations of the lineage in the specific circumstances that each of them had faced. She practiced those applications in the Deadwood with the specificity of someone who understood that understanding a capability intellectually was not the same as being able to use it under pressure. By the end of the 2nd month, she was using it without thinking about it. The 3rd month, she used to think. She had the Keeper function. She had the full inheritance. She had the Deadwood as her territory and the territory sense as her intelligence network and 3 months of the ancestral grounds accumulated knowledge as her foundation. She had a rejected mate bond that was unresolved, which in the old law the lineage text cited was not actually resolved by a public rejection declaration. A public rejection from one side was not the same as a mutual dissolution. The bond existed in the old law as a bilateral thing. One party declaring it gone did not make it gone. It simply made one party wrong about what they had done. She had a mother who had been killed by someone who understood enough about the lineage to know she needed to be removed before she could pass the full inheritance to her daughter, which meant someone in the current power structure understood what the lineage was and had decided it was a threat worth eliminating through murder. She had 240 witnesses to a public rejection that had been used as a weapon against her. She had the Alpha King's intelligence apparatus, which she knew from the territory sense had received at least one report about the Deadwood anomaly, and which she understood would eventually produce a response that came north to investigate. She had been thinking about the Alpha King. Not because the mate bond had anything to do with him. It did not. The mate bond was Caden Voss's miscalculation, and it was going to be addressed on its own terms in its own time. She had been thinking about the Alpha King because the lineage text's description of the Keeper function included one piece of information that she had been sitting with for 3 months and that she had not yet decided what to do with. The Keeper function had a complement. Not a mate bond in the standard sense. Something older. The text called it the anchor bond, the pairing of the Keeper with the bloodline that had been carrying the anchor function in a dormant state. A lineage that would not know what it carried until it stood in proximity to the Keeper and the proximity activated it. The anchor function was described in the texts as the stabilizing complement of the Keeper. The Keeper held territory. The anchor held structure. Together they produced something neither could produce separately. The text said the anchor bloodline was always a governing line. There was only one governing line in the 6 territories. The Alpha Kings. She had been thinking about that for 3 months. On the last day of the 3rd month, she shifted and ran the full perimeter of the Deadwood in the dark, and the old forest moved with her like something breathing, and she came back to the Heartwood clearing and pressed her hand to the recognition stone and said to the accumulated wisdom of 8 generations of women who had survived and carried and passed forward, "I am ready." The stone was warm under her palm. She took that as agreement. Chapter 3. The King Who Came North. Alpha King Revan Ashur had been ruling the 6 territories for 8 years and had developed in that time the specific kind of patience that comes from learning through experience that the fastest response to an unclear situation is almost always the second best response to it, and that the best response requires the additional time that patience makes available. He was patient about almost everything. He had not been patient about the Deadwood reports. The first 2 he had routed through standard intelligence processing and received standard intelligence summaries in return. The 3rd one he had read himself, and reading it himself had produced the specific reaction of a man whose pattern recognition has been doing its work in the background across 3 reports and has just delivered a conclusion that the conscious mind had not yet caught up to. Something was in the Deadwood. Not a standard territorial anomaly. Not a rogue wolf or an unregistered settlement or any of the categories his intelligence system had been trained to identify and classify. Something that his intelligence system did not have a category for, which was itself information. He had also received, through a completely separate intelligence channel that he maintained with a different level of security than the standard pack network, a report from one of his oldest sources inside the Ironvale pack territory. The report was about a rejected mate, the circumstances of the rejection, the timing, and the specific detail that the rejected wolf had been classified as Omega with no wolf form on record and had been left in the Deadwood in midwinter without shelter. His source had noted that the Ironvale Pack's official position was that the Omega had died in the Deadwood. His source had also noted, with the specific careful language of someone reporting something they were not entirely certain how to categorize, that the Ironvale border wolves had been reporting unusual behavior in the northern Deadwood sector since approximately 3 days after the rejection. The timing was the part that his pattern recognition was working on. He went north with a company of 8. Not military formation. Travel configuration, compact and fast, and carrying no pack territory insignia because he was entering a boundary zone between territories, and the insignia would have complicated every interaction he had along the way. He had told Corvin, his head of intelligence, where he was going. Corvin had said nothing for a long moment and then said, "The Deadwood." Revan had said, "Yes." Corvin had said, "The Deadwood that your border wolves will not enter." Revan had said, "Yes." Corvin had said, "Because of what is in it." Revan had said, "I want to understand what is in it." Corvin had said, "And if what is in it is something your wolves cannot handle." Revan had said, "Then I will handle it personally, or I will conclude that handling is not the appropriate response. I will not know which until I have more information." Corvin had made the expression he always made when Revan was going to do something that Corvin would have advised against, but that Corvin also understood was the right decision for reasons that exceeded his advisory remit. Revan had gone north. The Deadwood boundary was everything the reports had described. He felt the edge of it the way you feel the edge of deep water when you are standing in shallows, the specific transition from something that operates on a recognizable scale to something that does not. His company stopped automatically at the boundary, and he looked at them and saw in their posture the involuntary response that the territory's signal produced in wolves who did not have the specific relationship with it that the signal required. He said, "Wait here." He went in alone. The Deadwood received him differently than it received his company. He felt that immediately, felt the forest shift from the quality of a defended territory, acknowledging an intruder, to something more complex and less clear. The quality of a territory that was registering him as something it was not yet sure how to categorize. Not threat. Not ally. Something it was still deciding about. He moved north through the forest. He moved north for 40 minutes without seeing anything that his standard wolf sense could make a report about. What he experienced was not visible. It was the specific accumulated quality of a place that had been deeply inhabited by something for long enough that the inhabitation had become indistinguishable from the place itself. He felt watched. Not watched in the way of a threat that was tracking him. Watched in the way of something very aware of him that had not yet decided what it was going to do about his presence. He stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the deadwood and he said, quietly and without directing it at anything specific because he did not know what direction to direct it in, "I am here because I want to understand. Not to contain or classify or report. To understand." The forest was quiet for a moment. Then she came through the trees. She was in human form, and she moved through the deadwood the way people move through a room they have been living in for a long time, with the ease of someone for whom the environment is not a context, but a continuous and familiar presence. She was wearing the clothing of the deadwood winter, dark brown leather and heavy wool, close-fitted and built for the terrain, with boots that had seen 3 months of the old-growth forest and showed it. Her hair was dark and worn loose, thick and slightly wild from the forest. Her skin was deep warm brown. And her eyes, when she stopped 12 feet from him and looked at him directly, were the color of very old gold. He had never seen eyes that color. His wolf went immediately and absolutely still. Not the stillness of threat assessment. The stillness of something that has just encountered the specific frequency it has been carrying an undirected response to for 30 years of being the Alpha King and never understanding why certain things felt incomplete in a way he had not been able to name. His wolf named it now. He said, "You are alive." She said, "I have been alive for 3 months while the Irevale Pack maintained the official position that I was dead." He said, "I know." She said, "You came north to understand what is in the deadwood." He said, "Yes." She said, "And what your wolf is telling you right now about what it found here." He said, "Yes. Both of those things." She looked at him with those deep gold eyes for a long moment. She said, "Your name is Revenashur. You have been ruling the 6 territories for 8 years. You came north with 8 wolves and left them at the boundary and came into the deadwood alone, which tells me you were not certain your company could handle what was in here and you did not want to find that out while they were with you." He said, "That is accurate." She said, "I am going to tell you something that is going to require some adjustment on your part. I am telling you directly rather than building to it, because I have spent 3 months in the Deadwood learning things that I have been carrying in incomplete form for 22 years, and I no longer have any patience for managing other people's comfort around information they need to have." He said, "Tell me." She told him. She told him about the lineage. About the full inheritance and the keeper function and the ancestral ground and the 8 generations of women who had passed what they carried forward to this clearing in the Deadwood. She told him about the anchor function and what the lineage text said about the governing line that carried it. She told him what his wolf was responding to and why and what it meant in the framework of the old bloodline law that predated the current pack governance structure by 400 years. She told him all of it without softening any of it. When she finished, the forest was quiet, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just received a comprehensive account of something he has been living inside without understanding it, and who is in the process of integrating the account with 30 years of unnamed experience. He said, "The mate bond." She said, "The anchor bond." Which is not the same as the standard mate bond and is not activated by the same mechanism and does not operate on the same timeline. It is activated by proximity between the keeper and the governing line carrying the dormant anchor function. The proximity requirement is met when both parties are in the keeper's territory simultaneously. She said, "You are in my territory." He said, "I noticed that." A pause. He said, "The Ironvale Alpha's rejection," she said, "was a public declaration that the old law does not recognize as a bilateral dissolution of the bond. The bond exists in the old law as a bilateral thing. What he did was remove himself from my pack bond and territory protection and call it a rejection. What he actually did was strand himself on one side of an existing bond without the other party's agreement." She said, "The bond is still there. I am simply the one who is going to decide what to do with it now." He said, "What are you going to do with it?" She said, That is a question I have been sitting with for 3 months. I am not going to answer it today. He said, I am not asking you to. She said, I know. I am noting that the timeline for the answer is mine. He said, I understand. He said, I have 8 wolves at the boundary who came north without understanding what they were coming to. I owe them an account. She said, you can tell them the Deadwood situation has been assessed and is not a threat to the 6 territories. He said, and if they ask what is in the Deadwood? She said, tell them the keeper came home. He looked at her. He said he would like to come back. She said, I know. She said, come back in 3 days. Come alone. There are things in the Heartwood clearing that I want you to see. He went back to his company. He gave them the account she had authorized. He returned in 3 days. He came alone. This story is not finished with you yet. Subscribe and leave a comment and tell us what you think of Nara. Share this story with every person you know who deserves a wolf romance where the woman left to die comes back wearing the fear of everyone who underestimated her. Like the video. Comment your most powerful moment. Share it everywhere. Every subscribe, every like, every share, every comment keeps this story alive. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Chapter 4. What the Forest Witnessed. The Irevale pack made its move on the 48th day after Revan first entered the Deadwood. Not Caden Voss. The move was not his design. Caden had settled into his new political alliance with the Silver Brand Pack Alpha's daughter and had filed Nara Cole in the category of resolved, the category that contained things he had decided were behind him and that his characteristic and curiosity about consequences had convinced him would stay there. The move came from someone inside the Irevale Pack Council who understood considerably more than Caden about what the Deadwood anomaly meant. His name was Elder Vorith, and he was 70 years old and had been sitting on the Ironvale Pack Council for 32 of those years. And he was one of exactly 4 people currently alive who knew enough about the old lineage texts to understand what the Deadwood anomaly reports were describing. He was also the person who had arranged the sickness that killed Nara's mother. He had made his assessment 11 years ago that the lineage needed to end with Nara Cole before it could pass the full inheritance to her daughter. He had acted on that assessment with the specific cold efficiency of a man who had been managing threats to the current power structure for 32 years and understood that managed threats were preferable to eliminated threats because managed threats could be monitored and eliminated threats sometimes produced consequences that were difficult to predict. He had miscalculated Nara Cole's capacity to pass the inheritance to her 12-year-old daughter in the last hours before she died. He had then miscalculated Caden Voss, whom he had been managing for 7 years, when he concluded that the public rejection and the Deadwood abandonment would produce a keeper who died in the cold before she could find the ancestral ground. He was aware now that he had miscalculated twice. He was not going to miscalculate a 3rd time. He assembled a force of 45 wolves, which was the maximum he could pull from the Ironvale Pack's training reserve without triggering Caden's attention. And he told them they were conducting a Northern Territory security operation to assess and neutralize an unregistered wolf presence in the Deadwood boundary sector. He told them the presence was a rogue wolf of unknown capability and that overwhelming force was the appropriate response. He did not tell them the rest. Nara felt them at the Deadwood boundary the moment they assembled. The territory sense was specific enough at 3 months of depth that she could read the composition of what was at the boundary, the number of wolves, their general capability level, and the quality of their intent. The intent of 45 wolves who had been told they were going to neutralize something in the Deadwood was not ambiguous. Revan was in the Heartwood clearing with her when she felt them. He had been coming to the Heartwood every 3 days for 6 weeks. He had been reading the lineage texts. He had been sitting with the recognition stone and receiving what the stone chose to give him, which had been, across 6 weeks of visits, a progressively clearer picture of the anchor function he had been carrying in his bloodline without knowing it. He had been learning what the anchor function was and what it did and how it worked in the complementary relationship the old law described. He had been doing all of this with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was learning was not theoretical and that the practical implications of it were going to require decisions he could not afford to make incorrectly. He had also been doing it because the Heartwood was the place Nara was, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that the anchor bond he had been reading about in the lineage texts was not the only reason he kept returning. She had not yet told him she was aware of that. She said, 45 Ironvale Pack wolves at the southern Deadwood boundary. Not a scout unit. A combat force. He said, Caden. She said, not Caden's design. The formation discipline is too specific and the response timing is too calibrated for someone who does not know what they're responding to. This is someone who knows what the Deadwood anomaly means. He said, Elder Vorith. She looked at him. He said, he has been on the Ironvale Council for 32 years. He was 3 years on the Alpha King's Advisory Council before that. He is one of 4 people I know of who have access to the complete old bloodline archive. He said, he is also the person my intelligence coordinator has been investigating in connection with the death of your mother. The Heartwood clearing was quiet. Nara said, you knew. He said, I did not know when I first came to the Deadwood. I had a partial picture. The investigation has produced more across the last 6 weeks. She said, you should have told me. He said, yes. I should have. I was waiting until the investigation was complete because incomplete information in a situation this sensitive produces worse decisions than waiting. That calculation was mine to make and I made it without telling you and I understand why that is a problem. She held that. She said, we will discuss that later. Right now I need to know if you have any wolves outside the Deadwood who can be positioned at the eastern and western boundaries within the next 2 hours. He said, Corvin has been at the southern staging position since day 3. I sent him there when I understood what the Deadwood situation was and understood that the Ironvale Council would eventually try to address it. She said, how many? He said, 32. Experienced combat wolves. She said, positioned at the eastern and western boundaries, they close the available exit routes for the Ironvale force when it enters the Deadwood. The Ironvale wolves enter the southern edge and do not get out the way they came in. She said, I will handle the interior. He said, alone. She said, the Deadwood is my territory. In my territory, I am not alone. He said, I am staying with you. She said, the anchor function. He said, has nothing to do with it. I am staying because what happens in this clearing in the next 2 hours matters, and I am not going to be at the boundary for it. She looked at him with those deep gold eyes. She said, Corvin. He sent the signal. The 45 Ironvale wolves entered the Deadwood at the southern boundary, and the forest received them the way the Deadwood received things that were not welcome in it, which was with the specific quality of atmospheric resistance that was not obstruction, but was unmistakably communication. The trees were close. The light was wrong. The sounds were not the sounds that the forest produced for wolves who belonged in it. They went north anyway because Vorith had given them an objective and they had been told what to do about hesitation. They reached the first kilometer of the Heartwood sector and the territory sense hit them. Not as a physical force. As a signal that went below the level of conscious processing and spoke directly to the wolf nature in each of them about where they were and what they had entered and the classification of the thing they had been sent to neutralize. The wolf nature said, this is not a territory you take. This is a territory that is already occupied by something that outclasses every metric you use to assess these situations. 17 of the 45 stopped. They stopped not because they decided to stop, but because their wolves had already decided for them, and the decision was not reversible by their commanders. The other 28 kept moving because Vorith had embedded his 3 most experienced wolf commanders in the formation specifically to manage the instinctive avoidance response. 28 wolves came into the outer Heartwood sector. Nara shifted. The Heartwood clearing filled with the specific light of the ancestral ground fully activated, the deep warm luminescence that the recognition stone produced when the Keeper was in full expression within the territory. And the 28 wolves at the outer sector edge received it in the way that pack wolves received the Keeper's signal, involuntarily and completely. 10 more stopped. The 18 who continued were the 3 commanders and 15 wolves who had enough conditioning and enough direct instruction from Vorith to override the instinctive response for the duration of an engagement. 18 wolves in the Heartwood sector, against the Keeper in full expression on her own ground. The fight was not what the 18 wolves had been told to expect. Vorith had briefed them on a rogue wolf of unknown capability, which was a description that mapped onto known categories of threat and produced a known tactical response. What the 18 wolves encountered in the Heartwood sector was not an unknown rogue wolf. It was the specific thing that the old law had been designed to protect, and that the 400-year suppression effort had been designed to prevent from reaching this expression. The territory fought with her. Not in the visible dramatic way of a story. In the specific functional way of a territory that has an active keeper, which meant that the ground and the tree cover and the air movement all responded to the engagement as extensions of the keeper's will rather than as neutral environmental factors. The footing that was unstable for the 18 wolves was not unstable for the same reasons in every location. The sight lines that closed at critical moments closed because the territory closed them. The temperature that dropped in specific sectors when wolves positioned in those sectors were pushed into them was not coincidence. Revan stayed at the Heartwood clearing edge and watched. He had the anchor function at partial activation, enough to feel the territory's response to Nara's direction and to understand what was happening in the sector without being able to see all of it. He felt every engagement as a wave through the ground and through the shared frequency that the anchor bond had been building across 6 weeks of proximity. He also watched the 17 wolves who had stopped at the first kilometer and the 10 who had stopped at the outer sector and understood that they were not threats. They were wolves who had been given incorrect information and whose wolf nature had done exactly what wolf nature was supposed to do when it encountered something categorically above its operational framework. He sent them a signal through the anchor function, the specific frequency that a governing line could broadcast in Keeper territory with the Keeper's permission, which was a capability the lineage texts had described and that he had spent 6 weeks learning without being certain he could actually use it. The signal said, "Stand down. You are not in danger if you stand down." 27 wolves stood down. The engagement in the Heartwood sector concluded 12 minutes after it began. The 3 Irevale commanders and 7 of the 15 conditioning-hardened wolves were down, not dead, injured in the specific way of wolves who had been overwhelmed by a force categorically above their capacity and who would recover and remember and make very different decisions about their next assignment. The other 8 had broken and run. Nara shifted back. She walked out of the Heartwood sector to the clearing where Revan was standing, and she looked at him and she said, "Elder Vorith did not come himself." He said, "No. He sent the force and stayed at the Ironvale packhouse." She said, "Then the engagement is not complete." He said, "Corvin has been moving to the Ironvale packhouse position since the Deadwood Forest deployed. Vorith will be in custody by the time we leave the Deadwood." She said, "You anticipated this." He said, "I anticipated that an intelligence operation that had been managing the lineage suppression for 32 years would not expose its primary actor in the field engagement. Vorith is careful. He sends forces. He does not lead them." He said, "I have been building toward this for 6 weeks." She said, "You should have told me that too." He said, "Yes, I should have." She said, "We are going to need a longer conversation about what you share with me and when, if this is going to work." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not saying it is not going to work. I am saying we need that conversation." He said, "I agree completely." She looked at the Heartwood clearing, at the recognition stone warm and present in its center, at the forest that had fought with her and had done exactly what it was built to do after 3 months of learning its keeper. She said, "What happens to Caden?" He said, "The public rejection under false pretense of a classified wolf is a treaty violation. The falsification of your classification record, which the investigation has confirmed was arranged by Vorith with Caden's knowledge, is a separate violation. Both are actionable under the Interpact Treaty framework." He said, "What happens to him depends on what you want to happen to him." She said, What I want is for every wolf in the 6 territories to know the accurate account of what was done to me and what I am and what happened in this forest. I want the accurate account in the official treaty record. I want his pack leadership status reviewed. And I want the mate bond formally addressed under the old law rather than under the public rejection custom, because the old law gives me the rights that the rejection custom took from me. She said, I do not want his destruction. I want the truth. She said, the truth is enough. Revan looked at her. He said, that is the most complete answer anyone has given me to that question. She said, I have been thinking about it for 3 months. Chapter 5. What she built after. Elder Voreth was in custody before they left the Deadwood. Corvin's operation had moved with the precision of 7 years of intelligence work converging on a single arrest, and the specific quality of the custody was the quality of an arrest that had been prepared for carefully rather than improvised under pressure. Voreth had been at the Ironvale packhouse when Corvin's wolves arrived, apparently expecting the communication that his 45-wolf force had succeeded and the Deadwood situation had been neutralized. The communication he received was different. He was in Alpha King custody before he understood that the engagement had not gone as planned. Caden Voss was informed of the custody at the same time the formal treaty violation notices were delivered to the Ironvale Pack Council. His reaction to both pieces of information simultaneously was the specific reaction of someone who had been living inside a managed situation without knowing it was managed and has just had the management revealed and the consequences handed to him in the same moment. He did not handle it with distinction. The treaty violation review process took 4 months. Not because the evidence was insufficient. The investigation file that Corvin had been building for 6 weeks plus the lineage documentation from the Heartwood clearing plus the ancestral ground authentication that 3 independent bloodline scholars confirmed across 2 months of review constituted a record that was more comprehensive than most treaty violation proceedings received. For months, because the implications of the case extended beyond the Ironvale Pack and the Voreth network and required a restructuring of the intelligence framework that governed how old bloodline classifications were handled in the 6 territories. Nara was at the center of that restructuring. Not because Revan had positioned her there. Because she had walked into the first Treaty Council session with the lineage texts and the ancestral ground documentation and 3 months of thinking about institutional structures, and had produced in 40 minutes of testimony a framework for old bloodline. Recognition that the Treaty Council had not been able to construct in 400 years of trying. Corvin had said, after that session, that he had never seen a Treaty Council go quiet in the specific way it had gone quiet when she finished speaking. Revan had said, that is the keeper function applied to governance rather than territory. Corvin had said, I see. The mate bond question was addressed in the 3rd month of the proceedings under the old law framework that Nara had specified. The old law's bilateral dissolution requirement meant that Caden's public rejection was documented as an abandoned bond claim rather than a mutual dissolution, which in the treaty record had the specific legal effect of assigning to Nara all protections and rights she would have held under the bond at its full recognition, retroactively from the date of the rejection. It also assigned to Caden the formal liability for abandoning a bond claim without the other party's agreement, which under the old law was a category of violation with specific consequences. Caden's pack leadership review was a separate proceeding. His knowledge of Voreth's operations, documented through the investigation, established that his complicity in the classification falsification and the deliberate abandonment of a protected wolf had been knowing rather than negligent. The review board's finding was removal from alpha status pending a succession process. Nara was not at the review board proceeding. She was in the Heartwood clearing when the finding was delivered, which was not a coincidence. She had chosen to be there because the Heartwood was where she did her clearest thinking, and what she was thinking about that day was not Caden Voss and what happened to him. She had thought about that enough. The treaty process was addressing it on the terms she had specified, and those terms were adequate, and she was done spending her attention on it. She was thinking about the anchor bond. She had been thinking about it with increasing specificity across 4 months of Revan's presence in her life, first in the Heartwood, then in the capital city where the treaty proceedings required her to be, then across the specific texture of 4 months of working alongside someone who was consistently exactly what he presented himself as and who had made one significant mistake in not telling her about Vorith early enough and had acknowledged it directly and had not made it again. For months was a data set she found adequate for the conclusions she was drawing. Revan came to the Heartwood on the day the Caden Review Board delivered its finding. He had sent word ahead that he was coming, and she had sent word back that she would be at the recognition stone. He came through the Deadwood alone as he always did now, and the forest received him the way it had been receiving him for 4 months, with the ease of a territory that had made its assessment and found him to be someone whose presence in it was not incursion, but something the territory had made room for. He sat beside her at the recognition stone. He said, "The finding was delivered this morning." She said, "I know. I felt it through the territory sense when the Iron Veil Pack received the communication." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I have been more than all right for 4 months. The finding is the treaty process doing what it was supposed to do. I am not affected by it in the way you might be asking about." He said, "I am glad." She said, "I have something to tell you." He waited. She said, "I have been thinking about the anchor bond for 4 months. The lineage texts are specific about what it is and how it works and what the practical implications are for both parties. I have read those sections more times than I have read any other section, and I have been using the Recognition Stones archive to fill in the parts the texts do not cover in sufficient detail." She said, "What I arrived at is this. The anchor bond is real, and I feel it, and I have been feeling it since the first day you walked into the Deadwood and the territory recognized what you were. The feeling has been getting more specific across 4 months, and I am not going to pretend it has not, because pretending things are not happening is something I spent 10 years doing, and I am not willing to spend more time on it." She said, "I am also not going to collapse what I feel for you into what the anchor bond does, because I spent 22 years in a pack that treated every wolf as an expression of their classification rather than as a person, and I know what it costs to be reduced to your function. I am not going to do that to either of us." She said, "So what I want to tell you is that the anchor bond is real and I accept it on its own terms, and what I feel for you beyond that is also real and I accept it on its own terms, and those two things are both true and neither of them is a substitute for the other." She said, "I wanted you to know that I am making a distinction." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been making the same distinction for 4 months without being certain you were making it too." She said, "I noticed." He said, "You noticed." She said, "I have had territory sense at full depth for 4 months. I notice things." Something moved across his face that was the complete absence of the governing line composure he wore in every other context. He said, "The treaty restructuring is going to require a permanent seat for the old bloodline framework on the Interpack Council. The Keeper function has governance implications that the current council structure does not have a mechanism for. I have been drafting the seat proposal for 6 weeks." She said, "I know. I read the first draft." He said, "I left it in the Heartwood clearing." She said, "You left it in my territory." I read everything in my territory." He said, "I will remember that." She said, "The draft is good. The 3rd paragraph of the 2nd section needs revision. The language implies the seat is advisory when the old law framework makes it co-equal for territory governance decisions. I have written a replacement paragraph." He said, "You have written a replacement paragraph for my council seat proposal." She said, "Would you like to see it?" He said, "Yes. Obviously." She handed him the folded paper from inside her coat. He read it. He said, "This is better than what I had." She said, "I know." He looked at her with those amber-flecked dark eyes that she had been reading accurately for 4 months, and that had not once communicated anything she had subsequently found to be false or incomplete, and he said, "I have been thinking about something for 4 months that I want to ask you." She said, "Ask it." He said, "Is the Heartwood clearing large enough for 2 people to live in it?" She looked at the clearing. At the recognition stone warm in the afternoon light. At the old trees at the perimeter that had been growing in this arrangement for centuries. At the space that had been hers completely for 4 months and that had been, For the last 4 of those months, also his in the specific way that a space becomes someone's not through possession, but through the quality of their presence in it. She said, "It is large enough." She said, "The Deadwood is 40 kilometers. There is considerable room." He said, "That is not what I asked." She said, "I know." She looked at him. She said, "Yes. It is large enough." The Interpack Council ratified the old bloodline framework seat in the 7th month. The Keeper's seat was co-equal for territory governance decisions, as the replacement paragraph specified. Vortha's trial produced a formal record of the 32-year suppression operation that was entered into the treaty archive and has been accessible to any wolf in the 6 territories who chooses to look at it since the 8th month. The Deadwood is not called the Deadwood anymore. The pack wolves who border it have a new name for it, informal and not in any official record, the kind of name that spreads through a community because it describes something accurately. They call it the Keeper's Wood. In the Heartwood clearing, the recognition stone is warm in all seasons now, which the 3 bloodline scholars who visited to complete their authentication report found unusual, and which all 3 of them independently attributed to the same cause. The Keeper came home. And she did not leave. That is the story of Nara Cole, the Omega who was rejected in front of 240 wolves and left to die in a winter forest, and came back carrying the inheritance of 8 generations of women who had survived impossible circumstances and passed what they carried forward so that she would have it when the moment came. If this story moved you, then do these 4 things right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment and tell us your favorite moment. Was it the Heartwood, the bond, the fight, or the clearing at the end? Share this with every person who deserves a wolf heroine who does not wait to be valued. Like the video so more people find Nara. Subscribe, like, comment, and share.